After being captured by the Soviets in the last days of the war, Rochus Misch was taken to Moscow, interrogated for weeks, and sent without trial to various Gulag camps. He spent almost 9 years between transfers, forced labor, and mandatory silence. When he returned to Berlin in 1954, he set up a small shop and lived without attracting attention. For decades, he repeated that he was only Hitler's telephone operator and avoided any discussion about the past. In his final years, he began to speak and did so without changing anything and without showing repentance. He said he didn't know, that he didn't ask, that he was only fulfilling his duty. But after keeping silent for so long, why did he choose to speak when no one could judge him anymore? The arrival of Adolf Hitler to power in 1933 marked the beginning of an era of profound and devastating changes for Germany and the world. The Nazi Party, under his leadership, quickly prevailed over the democracy of the Weimar Republic, using a combination of propaganda, intimidation, and political alliances to consolidate power. In the first years of the regime, Hitler established an authoritarian structure that placed around him a series of key figures who would serve to implement his totalitarian vision. The Nazi regime not only relied on military force, but also on paramilitary organizations such as the SA, Sturmabteilung, and the SS, Schutzstaffel, which initially had security and demonstration control functions, but which over time became the pillars of internal repression. The SAS, under Himmler's direction, began to gain power and expand its influence within the regime. They were responsible for internal security, the persecution of opponents, and the implementation of extermination policies. As the Third Reich solidified, the SS consolidated as a key organization with a well-defined hierarchical structure, which rapidly expanded to cover aspects of power management, secret police, and the systematic persecution of minorities. These men, some of them Hitler's personal confidants, became the Führer's closest collaborators and were responsible for executing the regime's darkest decisions. While all this was happening in the high circles of Nazi power, figures like Rochus Misch began to form part of the regime's machinery. Although he did not belong to the inner circle of power, Misch was chosen to join one of Hitler's trusted units, the Begleitkommando des Führers, in charge of his personal protection and communications. Rochus Misch was born in the Silesia region in 1917. He lost his parents while still a child. His mother died when he was barely 2 years old, and his father, who had served as a soldier in the Great War, passed away shortly after, so he was raised by his grandparents in a simple environment marked by privations. From a young age, he showed an inclination for drawing and thought of training as a graphic artist, although the political and economic situation of Germany in the 1930s altered those expectations. The rise of the National Socialist Party coincided with his adolescence, and like many others of his generation, he was influenced by propaganda, the desire for stability, and the promise of a different future. Life in Silesia offered few alternatives, and the army appeared as a secure way out. Upon reaching adulthood, he entered vocational school, and at the same time began to consider military service as a permanent option. In 1937, he enlisted in the newly organized Waffen-SS, a unit created as the military arm of the SS, distinct from the traditional formations of the regular army. His incorporation was not the result of deep ideological convictions, but rather an opportunity to secure stable employment, with regular pay and a framework of discipline that offered him prospects. After recruitment, he underwent basic instruction in physical exercises, weapon use, and strict obedience. The training was rigorous and sought to form resilient soldiers, capable of following orders without hesitation. His first assignment was in a company of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the Führer's elite guard, though in campaign military functions. In September of 1939, he participated in the invasion of Poland, the first major operation of the war. During that advance, he was seriously wounded in the chest by enemy fire, which put him out of combat for several months. He was transferred to field hospitals, where he remained in prolonged recovery. His condition did not allow him to return to the front, and doctors recommended his reassignment to less physically demanding tasks. That circumstance changed the course of his life, as instead of returning to a combat division, he was assigned to internal SS services. In 1940, he was assigned to the Begleitkommando des Führers, the small detachment responsible for Hitler's personal security. The group was composed of a few carefully selected men, and their function combined the physical protection of the leader with messenger and communication tasks. Misch's transfer to that unit was not the result of a personal request, but an administrative decision based on his medical condition and the need to fill vacancies. Thus, he went from a private in a field company to a member of a small circle around the Führer. Joining that formation meant a radical change in his routine. He was no longer a combatant in trenches, nor a recruit in exercises, but a member of the closest escort to the head of the German state. From the beginning, he received clear instructions. He had to remain always available, obey orders without delay, not intervene in conversations, and maintain absolute silence about what he saw or heard. Discretion was the main rule. The Begleitkommando functioned as an extension of the security apparatus, but with much stricter internal rules. Direct contact with Hitler was not constant, but it was possible, and that demanded impeccable conduct. Superiors made it clear that any lapse could mean immediate expulsion. The first time Misch saw Hitler in person was in Berlin in the year 1940, when he was already formally integrated into the escort. There was no special introduction or conversation. He simply observed him passing by, surrounded by officers, while he performed his liaison function. That scene marked the beginning of a relationship of proximity without familiarity. From then on, Misch became one of the men who accompanied the Führer on transfers, trips and stays in different headquarters. His role was double: to act as a messenger and to cover operator functions in the personal telephone exchange that was installed wherever Hitler moved. The messaging missions consisted of transporting confidential documents and messages between offices, ministries and military commands. He had to move quickly and without arousing suspicion, often in official cars on monitored routes. The communication tasks were even more delicate. He was responsible for opening lines, connecting encrypted calls, and keeping the Führer's private communication system active. It was a technical job of absolute precision, where there was no room for errors or delays. Hitler's apparatus depended on that network, and those who managed it had the responsibility of ensuring its continuous operation. The atmosphere of the headquarters was marked by solemnity. Officers, aides, secretaries and escorts moved carefully, avoiding any unnecessary gestures. Power was not exercised with shouts or exaggerated demonstrations, but with long silences, fixed gazes and dry orders. Misch quickly adapted to that climate. He learned to disappear among the corridors, to walk without attracting attention, to be present without being seen. That capacity for invisibility was valued by his superiors, who kept him in the position for years. He himself acknowledged that what was important was not what he knew, but what he kept silent about. Hitler's residences, such as the Berghof in Obersalzberg or the Chancellery in Berlin, were settings where Misch carried out his work. In each displacement, he had to accompany the transfer of the telephone exchange, ensure that the lines were ready before the Führer's arrival, and remain on guard during periods of activity. The process was always the same: install, test, connect, and monitor. Success consisted of no one noticing his presence. When Hitler walked through the corridors, the staff moved aside and lowered their gaze. Misch did the same. There was no room for trivial conversations or for interactions outside of protocol. Travels were constant. Hitler moved by special train, by plane, or in a convoy, and with him his security and communication team moved. Misch was part of those movements, always attentive to setting up or dismantling equipment, checking connections, and ensuring that everything worked without interruption. On the train known as America, adapted as an armored car for the Führer, communication cabins were set up where he had to work long hours. At airfields, temporary devices were installed that he had to control with precision. Each transfer was a logistical operation that demanded discipline and coordination, and for Misch, it became part of the routine. The rules of confidentiality were absolute. He was forbidden to comment with other members of the escort on any information to which he had access. He could not even speak to his wife about his work. Secrecy was a constant burden, but also a protection. The instruction was clear: what was heard was not to be repeated. Telephone conversations could include sensitive military data, names of officers, or strategic instructions. Misch was obliged to hear without listening, to record without understanding, to comply without asking. That pattern of silence defined his entire career in the Begleitkommando. Misch's personal life remained in the background. Although he managed to marry during the war and have moments with his family, his time was conditioned by shifts at the exchange and by trips with the escort. Marriage became a brief space of normality amidst a life marked by war and secrecy. In his private environment, he also did not speak about what he did. He was a wall of silence even in his home. At the Reich Chancellery, located on Vossstrasse, he assumed the role of Adolf Hitler's official telephone operator. His room was situated in a secluded corridor, surrounded by assistants' offices and technical facilities. There was the Führer's private communication system, a table with cables, switches, blinking lights, and headphones hanging on metallic stands. His task was to manage this system, ensuring that the head of state's communications with ministries, barracks, and military commands remained open. The system was complex, with precise codes and encrypted lines that had to be maintained without interruptions. Any error could jeopardize a crucial communication. Misch, always attentive, connected calls between Berlin and barracks in Poland, France, or Norway with pinpoint accuracy. The discipline in his work was total, with no margin for error, where speed and accuracy were essential. The atmosphere in the Chancellery was defined by a constant silence. Employees moved through the corridors without making a sound, and although telephones rang in nearby offices, the electrical noise from Misch's communication board muffled everything. Orders were brief verbal exchanges, minimal. Himmler, Goebbels, Goering, and other hierarchs moved about, exchanging no more than fleeting glances and gestures of recognition. In that environment, physical and verbal contact was minimal. Hierarchy was indicated by simple gestures. Work at the Chancellery imposed an invisible discipline. Misch adapted quickly, learning to observe without showing reaction, to listen without getting involved, and to move without attracting attention. His function was not to interpret or understand what was happening, but to ensure that communications operated without interruptions. He was a figure who was close to everything, yet outside of everything at the same time. Secretaries and other employees followed a similar routine. They were dedicated to typing speeches, transcribing documents, and preparing official correspondence, but conversations were almost non-existent. The treatment was distant, almost impersonal. There was no talk of war or politics, only of daily tasks. Coldness and lack of familiarity were part of the system, and silence was an unwritten rule. Personally, Misch managed to marry Gerda in 1942, the woman he had met years before. His marriage was brief, with a few days of leave and a gift from the Chancellery, 2 boxes of wine, and a cash bonus. Although Misch's work remained his priority, the marriage offered him a respite amidst the constant pressure of the environment in which he lived. Nevertheless, his work breaks were always brief. The daily routine continued to dictate his life. Over time, the Chancellery became Hitler's main operations center, and Misch's travels became less frequent. The function of connecting Hitler with his generals and other ministries occupied long hours. The metallic sound of telephone connections and the constant coming and going of lines were part of his daily life. Discipline remained fundamental, and the pace of work was uninterrupted. As Allied bombings over Berlin intensified, security measures in the Chancellery were strengthened. Additional systems were installed in the basements, underground corridors, and armored entrances. Misch continued his work in that tense environment, moving equipment when necessary and adapting to the complex's new conditions. Although bombs rumbled outside, the communication system had to keep functioning. The relocation of offices to an underground area of the Chancellery marked a new change in dynamics. Although it was not yet the total confinement in the Führer bunker, the place was organized underground. Spaces became more reduced, windows disappeared, and the noise of air raids filtered through the walls. Conditions became oppressive, but the pace of work remained intact. Secretaries typed, officers dictated orders, and the telephone never stopped ringing. Amidst it all, the hierarchs passed through the corridors, but conversations with them were almost non-existent. Misch remained at his post in the connection room, distant from the circle of power. Although his position was physically close to the decision-makers, his access to them was almost nil. That paradox defined his experience, always present, yet completely on the sidelines. The discipline of silence also extended to his personal life. When he visited his wife, he avoided mentioning his work. Gerda knew she had to maintain discretion, that there were things that could not be asked. Thus, his home life remained separate from the environment in which he worked, where secrecy and confidentiality were paramount. As the war progressed and Berlin suffered more bombings, Misch's working conditions became more difficult. Cables, connections, and telephone systems were constantly repaired, while the city crumbled around him. But the exchange had to keep operating no matter what happened in the streets. The routine was uninterrupted. In January of 1945, when Berlin was already under constant siege by Soviet artillery, Adolf Hitler definitively moved into the Führerbunker, the underground complex built beneath the garden of the old Reich Chancellery. That shelter, designed with reinforced concrete walls, ventilation systems and reinforced corridors, became the regime's last operational center. Rochus Misch received the order to set up his post there, moving the private telephone exchange that was to keep the last lines connected between Hitler, the army, and the ministries still in operation. From that moment, the underground became his only world. The complex had two levels, the Vorbunker, closer to the surface, and the deep level where Hitler resided with his closest circle. In those narrow, windowless spaces, small bedrooms, improvised offices, a meeting room, secretaries' rooms, electric kitchens, and the Führer's personal office were installed. The lighting was artificial and flickering, the air was heavy with cigarette smoke and humidity, and the noise of generators replaced the silence of the surface. Misch settled in the communications room, surrounded by cables, switches, and headphones, forced to remain on alert 24 hours a day to ensure the phone worked. Life underground was organized around forced routines. Meals arrived on time thanks to small kitchens that worked with what little provisions remained. Reduced rations of bread, soup, and coffee were served, while the rest of the city suffered extreme scarcity. Shifts were divided among secretaries, duty officers, and security personnel. No one went outside except to perform essential functions. Contact with the surface was almost non-existent, save for the tremor that ran through the walls when Soviet artillery struck nearby streets. The noise was constant, and at night the echo of bombs vibrated through the corridors. In those weeks, the tension continued to mount. The news arriving was increasingly grim. From different garrisons, they reported that no men were left, that orders arrived when everything was lost, or that no one knew for sure who was in command. Still, the bunker's operation continued purely out of inertia. Hitler continued to receive reports, sign papers, and meet with the officers who still remained in Berlin, as if everything were salvageable. The atmosphere grew heavier with each passing day. Conversations became increasingly brief, movements more contained, and silence more revealing. Everyone knew the end was near, but no one said anything. Visits to the Führerbunker in those weeks became less and less frequent. Some high-ranking officials came to say goodbye or to seek the Führer's last instruction. Goebbels remained constantly with Hitler, while Bormann controlled access to his office. Himmler and Goering no longer appeared, and when their names were mentioned, it was to accuse them of treason. Misch watched these men pass through the corridors, heard their voices on the other side of the doors, but did not participate in the conversations. His role was to keep the line open and wait. Hitler's figure in those days was marked by physical exhaustion and isolation. He walked hunched over, dragging his feet, with a pale face and a lost gaze at times. He spent hours in his office, reviewing maps that no longer reflected reality, dictating orders to generals who had no troops, and speaking of strategic movements that were impossible to execute. Eva Braun, settled in an adjoining room, appeared serene, carefully dressed, behaving as if the outside world were not collapsing. She organized small gatherings, shared coffee, or chatted with the secretaries, always trying to maintain an appearance of normalcy. Misch's phone rang less and less. The lines with the West fell one after another until they became unusable. By the end of April, the only connections still working were internal or with nearby garrisons that resisted symbolically. On the 25th of April, Berlin was completely surrounded, and the bunker ceased to be a command center, becoming a dead-end refuge. From then on, the tension transformed into resignation. On the 30th of April in the afternoon, while the staff continued their routines amidst an increasingly thick silence, Otto Günscher emerged from Hitler's private room with a rigid face and announced, without exultation, that the Führer had died. Eva Braun lay beside him, also lifeless. No one screamed, no one ran. The news circulated in contained murmurs, and the previously agreed instructions were immediately carried out. Wrap the bodies, take them to the garden, and reduce them to ashes with gasoline. Misch did not directly witness the scene outside, but from the communications room he perceived the smell of smoke, the heat rising up the stairs, and the heavy silence of those returning. Günscher's uniform was stained, Bormann remained in the corridors without saying a word, and Goebbels continued at his post with a dull expression. The phone rang again, with an unknown voice wanting to confirm what had happened. Misch listened for a few seconds and hung up. There was nothing more to say. That same night, the tragedy repeated itself with the Goebbels family. Magda decided that her 6 children would not survive the collapse of the Reich. No one heard screams or cries. It was simply known that the children were taken to their rooms and did not come out again. Misch learned through whispered comments, through the hurried movements of doctors and assistants, and through the sudden silence that spread through the corridors. He understood they had died, although he never saw it with his own eyes. The atmosphere became even denser, and the last ones remaining there understood that everything was over. In the following days, the bunker slowly emptied. Some officers tried to escape through passages to the subway, others sought to reach the Soviet lines to surrender. Bormann disappeared in the confusion, and Goebbels, after formally assuming the chancellorship in replacement of Hitler, also ended up taking his own life with his wife. Misch remained at his post until he received the order to evacuate. He exited through one of the side exits in the middle of a ruined Berlin, with streets full of smoke and collapsed buildings. He carried only what was necessary, not knowing where to go or how much longer he could remain free. Thus ended his stay in the heart of Nazi power, underground, a witness to the last days of the Third Reich, marked by the silence of the Führer bunker's corridors and by the echoes of an end that needed no words to be understood. After the collapse of the bunker, when the remnants of the Third Reich were buried under the ruins of Berlin, Rochus Misch was arrested by Soviet forces. There was no trial or defense. He was put on a truck without explanation. For the following 9 years, his life was marked by interrogations, transfers, and the silence imposed in some corner of the Soviet Union. According to him, they did not know what to do with someone like him. He was not a high-ranking officer, nor did he appear in political decision archives, but his closeness to Hitler prevented him from being released outright. He spent the first months in the Lubyanka in Moscow, where he was interrogated daily and asked questions about the Führer's last days, the secret meetings, the names he remembered, and what happened in those final hours, although he insisted he had not been present. He said he knew nothing and could not invent what he had not seen. Later, he was sent to forced labor camps in Siberia. He was not the only one, but unlike others, Misch never had a formal process. They kept him imprisoned for what he represented, not for what he had done. He himself said that they never beat him to death, but to break him, that they wanted him to sign statements, to give names, to offer a useful narrative, but he insisted that he was a technician, not a criminal. During the years he spent prisoner, his family did not know if he was alive or dead. His wife believed him missing. There were no letters or news. When he was finally released, he returned to Berlin without documents, without money, and without an official explanation. No one was waiting for him. He walked alone to the address he remembered, knocked on the door, and it was his daughter who recognized him. He said that moment was more difficult than any day in Russia, because there at least he knew his place. In Germany he had none anymore. In the first years after his return, he tried to lead a normal life. He opened a small furniture store, learned to repair old objects, and avoided questions. Neighbors looked at him with distance. Some knew who he was, others pretended not to remember him. He did not speak of the past, not out of shame, but because he found no one to do so with. His version of events interested no one. The story had already been written, and there was no room for nuances. For decades he did not grant interviews or participate in public debates. He did not attend meetings or seek attention, saying he had had enough. As time passed, some journalists began to seek him out. They wanted to speak with one of the few who had been at the center of power until the end, and he agreed. From the 90s, his first statements appeared in the press. He responded with short phrases without emotions, saying he did not offer opinions, only recounted what he had seen. When asked if he regretted it, he replied that he had no reason to. He never killed anyone. He only performed technical functions. For many, that stance sounded like denial. For others, it was just the voice of someone who lived an experience without fully understanding it. He did not seek to justify the unjustifiable. He only wanted to make it clear that his role was limited, that he did not make decisions, that he did not attend private meetings, that his world was that of technical communication. He did not speak of ideology or shared responsibilities, only of functions and routines. For years he refused to write a book, saying it made no sense, that no one would believe his version. But towards the end of his life, he agreed to record his memoirs. He did so unadorned, narrating the facts from his perspective without interpreting or opining. The book was published with a simple title, The Last Witness. There he described his work alongside Hitler, the days in the Chancellery, the afternoons in the bunker, the silences of the last days. He recounted how he was arrested, how he survived Siberia, how he returned home without understanding what had really happened. In those pages there are no accusations, no apologies, no great revelations, only an attempt to put into words what he had kept for more than half a century. Some criticized him for not showing remorse, others considered it valuable for not misrepresenting what he lived. He remained firm. He did not seek rehabilitation or applause. He used to say that he only described what he had lived, without issuing judgments or opinions. In a late interview, he was asked what he thought of Hitler. He replied that he was not a monster to him, that he had treated him with respect, that he saw him as a severe but correct boss, that he never heard him raise his voice. That phrase generated controversy, but he did not retract it. He said that everyone had their own image of the Führer, and that his did not change anything that had happened. He did not deny the regime's crimes, he only said that he did not see them, that he did not experience them, that they were not part of his immediate environment. Misch died in 2013. He was buried discreetly without honors or tributes. Some associations protested the mere fact that he was given media coverage, others defended his right to tell his story. In the end, Rochus Misch's life was reduced to the memory of a witness who accompanied power without being part of it. His existence traversed war, defeat, imprisonment, and the return to a country that no longer recognized him. He never stopped insisting that his work was technical, not political, and that what kept him silent for so many years was the custom of obeying orders without questioning them. He died as the last of the men who remained in the bunker, clinging to the idea that his story would change nothing. His history remained an uncomfortable trace, situated between the routine of a telephone operator and the shadow of a regime that marked the 20th century.